Senator Singh.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. In the parliamentary break in July, I had the extraordinary opportunity to travel to Dharamsala, the exile capital of Tibet, with my colleague Senator Waters as part of an Australian Tibet Council delegation. The Australia-Tibet Council supports this exchange as a way of assisting members of Parliament to understand more deeply the situation of the Tibetan people. Tibet lies within Chinese territory amongst the peaks of the Himalayas, home to people with a deep and important connection to their culture and their home. Tibet has over 2,000 years of written history, and prior to occupation by China, existed as an independent sovereign state. Tibetan identity is built on a foundation of profound spirituality, and the leader of the Tibetan Buddhist religion, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, is known and revered the world over. Tragically, the leadership and the culture it represents is being systematically undermined by an occupying regime. Since China asserted its authority in the region in 1949, the loss of life, property and significant sites of heritage, for example more than 6,000 monasteries have been destroyed, has been equalled only by the corresponding loss of liberty, freedom and expression and culture. China has falsely imputed motives of violence and separatism to His Holiness in order to justify targeting Tibetan culture, and pursued a deliberate strategy of Chinese immigration and militarisation in order to subsume the local population. Under Chinese rule, teachers and religious leaders require permission to practice and are typically subject to forced re-education. Local language is totally delegitimised. The everyday commerce and movement of residents in Lhasa, the capital of Tibet, is subject to intense surveillance, and as a Prime Minister in exile of the Central Tibetan Administration, Dr Lobsang Sangai, explained when he was in Australia a short time ago, it is impossible for ordinary citizens to express their deeply held spirituality without fear of arrest, torture or even disappearance. Since last year, 49 Tibetans have taken the extraordinary step of setting themselves alight in order to highlight the oppression of their people and to assert a level of control over their own destiny. These self-immolations are not just acts of desperation, they are acts of political expression. Indeed, according to Dr Sangai, the self-immolations are somehow an assertion of freedom. You can restrain my freedom, but I can choose to die as I want. That a people should feel that their form of death is the only avenue for expression is an indication of the gravity and urgency of the situation in Tibet. Australia has a long-standing position of recognising China's sovereignty over the Tibetan Autonomous Region, but the principles of liberty, freedom of speech and expression and security of heritage that the Tibetan people seek are universal standards. Unfortunately, for many, the only option in order to openly practice their culture is to seek refuge in the exiled capital Dharamsala, located on this other side of the Himalayas in Himachal Pradesh, India. It is a city above the clouds, on the slopes of the Kangra Valley, not easily reached from by either the southern or the northern approach. It has, however, become home to the exiled government that represents Tibet. I had the privilege of learning about the traditional Tibetan Buddhism and meditation at the Gyoto Monastery and meeting His Eminence the Kampara. We also met with the director of the Tibetan Nuns Project, Mrs Rinchen Kando, at the nunnery at Sidhpur, and learnt of her work and the support that had been given to Tibetan nuns. The new reception centre for new arrivals seeking asylum, which has been funded by the US Congress, provides refuge and the necessary medical attention for new arrivals. Many arrive with frostbite and others injuries after enduring a journey across the Himalayan ranges to get to their place of freedom. Their records revealed that from 1991 to 2004, the centre had hosted a total of 43,634 new arrivals from Tibet, more than half of which had been children and young people under the age of 25. Yet I was informed that since 2008, the time of the Olympic Games in China, the military presence had increased dramatically in Tibet across the borders and in the streets, which has led to a reduction of new arrivals at the reception centre in Dharamsala. Nevertheless, while there, I was able to talk to some new arrivals who had only been there a day about their journey, their hopes and ambitions now that they were in freedom. Many had never had any formal education and had left their families behind for a future where they could be free to live out their lives. What Tibetans are doing every day in India is really what they should be able to do in Tibet, what we all take for granted. That is, to keep their culture alive, practice their art and language and religion. I'm so pleased the Indian government have provided support and the opportunity for Tibetans to educate their people, being able to learn their language and culture and practice their art through the Tibetan Institute of Performing Arts and Normalinku in Dharamsala. The Tibetan Children's Village is a remarkable achievement, with a number of students going on to become Rhodes Scholars and leaders all over the world. The Dalai Lama recognised in 1959 the need for so many refugee orphan children separated from their families would need a centre to care for them and to educate them. The TCV today houses, cares for and educates thousands of Tibetan children, and it was indeed an honour to be able to meet them. Their mission is to ensure that all Tibetan children under its care receive a sound education, a firm cultural identity, and become self-reliant and contributing members of the Tibetan community and at the world at large. And I have to say, I believe that is certainly being achieved at the TCV. Not only did we meet with the Tibetan Parliament-in-Exile, we also met with civil society, a number of Tibetan NGOs, including Tibetan Youth Congress, Tibetan Women's Association, Students for Free Tibet, Gu Chu Sum and the National Democratic Party for Tibet. Given the experience of the Tibetan people, it is perhaps no surprise that civil society has thrived when it has been allowed, and all of these organisations were run by passionate, dedicated individuals. I am pleased that Australia continues to highlight the question of Tibet in the Australian-China Human Rights Dialogue. However, China has recently closed entry to the region and refused a request from Australian officials to visit there and neighbouring Sichuan province. At the same time, under the guise of maintaining stability, 3,000 new troops have entered Tibet, with soldiers standing on the street corners and outside people's homes. And ultimately, the Tibetan character is one of humility, gentleness and hopefulness. Each person I met in Dharamsala is imbued with a powerful conviction that democracy will outlast authoritarianism, and Tibetan culture will once again thrive in the open air of their homeland. I sincerely hope that Australia and the world can continue to contribute to that worthy aim of making China understand that with power comes responsibility to all members of the human family.